Every morning, before the city of Jerusalem woke up, a priest slit the throat of a lamb, not occasionally, not on special occasions, every single morning, without exception, for over 1,000 years. Then every evening, a second lamb. The altar fire was never allowed to go out. Leviticus 6:13 makes this explicit. The fire shall be kept burning on the altar continually. It shall not go out. This was the minimum, the daily baseline before any other obligation was met. On top of the daily lambs came the weekly requirements, the monthly requirements, the festival requirements. At the dedication of Solomon's temple in 960 BC, the text records 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep slaughtered over 2 weeks. So many offerings that Solomon had to build additional altars in the courtyard because the main altar could not handle the volume. During Passover, at the height of the Second Temple period, the Roman historian Josephus and the Jewish Talmud both describe 1.2 million animals slaughtered in a single day. In 2013, a study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science found a city dump outside Jerusalem's walls dating to 37 BC through 66 AD, filled with an unusually high proportion of animal bones, sheep and goat bones with cut marks from butchery. Isotope analysis showed these animals came from rural desert regions hundreds of miles away, Arabia, Transjordan, confirming a massive interprovincial trade network existing for one purpose. Researcher Gideon Hartman of the University of Connecticut concluded that animal sacrifice powered the entire economy of ancient Jerusalem. Nearly 1/3 of all 613 commandments in the Mosaic Law relate to temple sacrifice and ritual. An entire book of the Torah, Leviticus, is almost entirely dedicated to how, when, and why animals must die. So the question that nobody asks, plainly enough, is this: why? Before you can understand the Israelite answer, you need to understand the world they were living in. Sacrifice was not an Israelite invention. It was the universal religious language of the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, sacrifice had been practiced since at least 2400 BC, the oldest known scapegoat ritual traceable to the city of Ebla. In Egypt, sacrificial offerings were central to every major temple. In Canaan, the land Israel entered, scholar Matthew Susno documents in The Practice of Canaanite Cult that sacrifice functioned as the primary mechanism for inviting deities into the natural landscape. Every civilization surrounding Israel sacrificed animals. The question was never whether to sacrifice. The question was to whom, under what rules, and for what purpose. Here is where Israel was different, and the difference was not in the practice. It was in the logic embedded inside the practice. The Israelite sacrificial system had 5 main categories, each serving a completely different function. Understanding them separately is the only way to understand what the system was actually designed to do. The first was the Olah, the burnt offering. The Hebrew word means ascending, or going up. The entire animal was consumed by fire. Nothing remained. Nothing was eaten. The whole animal went up in smoke toward God. This was the foundational daily sacrifice, the 2 lambs every morning and evening, and it represented total surrender, not payment for a specific sin, not a transaction, total consecration of life to God. The altar fire that could never go out was burning in Olah every morning when Jerusalem woke up and every evening when it slept. The second was the Chatat, the sin offering. This was not voluntary. Leviticus chapter 4 establishes that every category of person had a specific sin offering requirement when they violated God's law. The high priest brought a bull, a leader brought a male goat, a common person brought a female goat or lamb, and the poor brought 2 doves or pigeons. The animal grade scaled to the offender's social responsibility. The higher your position, the more expensive your sin offering. The system built accountability into the cost structure. The third was the Asham, the guilt offering, similar to the sin offering, but more specific. Leviticus chapter 5 describes it as the remedy for violations where something was owed, where sin created a concrete debt. If you deceived someone about property, if you withheld something belonging to another, if you swore falsely about a financial matter. The guilt offering required not only the animal sacrifice, but financial restitution at full value plus 20%. The sacrifice covered the spiritual dimension. The restitution covered the material damage. The system refused to separate the two. The fourth was the Shelamim, the peace offering or fellowship offering. This one is the most misunderstood because it did not involve wrongdoing at all. It was voluntary. It was celebratory. Most of this animal was actually eaten by the worshiper, by his family, by the priests, in a communal meal before God. The Talmud describes the temple as essentially a domestic setting, the house of God with furnishings, a lamp, a table. The altar was, in one scholar's precise description, a cooking surface where the sacrificial animal was prepared. The peace offering was a meal shared between God and his people, fellowship expressed through food. The fifth was the Minchah, the grain offering, not an animal. Fine flour, oil, frankincense, salt, never yeast or honey. This was the offering available to those who could not afford animals, and it carried full equivalence. The system was not restricted to the wealthy. Leviticus deliberately scaled downward. If you cannot bring a lamb, bring a dove. If you cannot bring a dove, bring fine flour. The access point was adjusted. The obligation was not removed. Now here is the mechanism, at the center of the entire system, the one detail that explains why blood specifically, why death specifically, why an animal and not simply a prayer or a coin. Leviticus 17:11, one of the most theologically loaded sentences in the entire Hebrew Bible. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. The logic is precise. Life is located in blood. This was not metaphor in the ancient world. It was observable physical reality. When blood left a body, life left with it. The Hebrew word for atonement is kafar, which in its root meaning carries the sense of covering, of wiping clean, of ransom paid. The blood of the animal, carrying its life, was placed on the altar as a covering for the life of the person who brought it. When the worshipper laid his hand on the head of the animal before it was killed, a gesture Leviticus describes repeatedly, he was not simply identifying the animal as his property. The laying on of hands transferred identification. The animal stood in for the person. Its death represented what the person deserved for the violation of covenant. The blood shed on the altar covered the debt the worshipper owed. This is not a primitive idea. It is a highly developed legal and theological logic. Violation creates debt. Debt requires payment. The payment the system establishes is a life, represented by blood, transferred to the altar. Now the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the 10th day of the 7th month, the single most important day in the entire Israelite religious calendar, and the ritual at its center is the strangest in the entire law. Leviticus 16. The high priest entered the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber of the tabernacle, and later the temple, where God's presence was said to dwell. Only on this one day per year. He brought a bull for his own sins first. Then he took 2 goats and cast lots between them, 2 identical goats, chosen to be as similar to each other as possible in size and appearance. Lots were cast to determine which goat was for God and which was for Azazel. The goat designated for God was slaughtered. Its blood was taken into the Holy of Holies and sprinkled on the mercy seat, the cover of the Ark of the Covenant, once upward and 7 times downward. This blood cleansed the sanctuary itself from the accumulated sins of the entire nation over the previous year. Then the high priest came to the living goat. He laid both hands on its head and confessed over it, audibly, verbally, all the iniquities of Israel, all their transgressions, all their sins. The text is emphatic about the comprehensiveness of the confession. Everything, not a category, not a selection, everything. Then the goat was sent into the wilderness, to Azazel. The word Azazel has been debated by scholars for centuries. Some translate it as a place, the solitary wilderness. The medieval commentator Ibn Ezra and the great 13th century scholar Maimonides both identified Azazel as a demonic figure, a fallen spirit, to whom the sin-laden goat was dispatched. The scapegoat ritual, traced by some scholars back to Ebla around 2400 BC, makes it the oldest continuous ritual in human religious history. 1 goat died. 1 goat carried the sins away, 2 animals accomplishing what one could not, the penalty paid and the sin removed. 2 inseparable aspects of what atonement required. From this ritual comes the English word scapegoat, introduced by William Tyndale in his 1530 translation of the Bible. A word now used in every language and context to describe someone who carries blame that belongs to others. Embedded permanently in human language from a single ritual performed in a desert tabernacle 3,000 years ago. Then in 70 AD, Rome destroyed the temple. In a single military campaign, the Roman general Titus burned the Second Temple to the ground. The altar went silent. The daily lamb stopped. The Yom Kippur ritual ceased. The sacrificial system that had operated continuously for over 1,000 years ended on a specific day, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of the month of Av, in the year 70 AD. And Judaism faced the most consequential theological crisis in its history. If the life of the flesh is in the blood, and it is the blood that makes atonement, what happens to atonement when the blood stops? Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, one of the leading rabbinic figures of the period, was walking with his student Rabbi Joshua near the ruins of the temple. Rabbi Joshua looked at the ruins and said, "Alas for us! The place that atoned for the sins of Israel lies in ruins." Rabbi Yohanan responded, "Be not grieved, my son. We have another atonement as effective as this. And what is it? Acts of loving kindness. As it is written, I desire mercy, not sacrifice." He quoted Hosea 6:6, a verse the prophet had written 7 centuries earlier. And on that quotation, Rabbinic Judaism rebuilt an entire theology of atonement without blood, centered on prayer, repentance, Torah study, and acts of compassion. The prayer services of Judaism were deliberately structured to parallel the sacrificial schedule. The extra Shabbat prayer service parallels the extra Shabbat offering. The timing of daily prayers parallels the morning and evening Talmud. Orthodox Judaism maintains that the temple sacrifices are temporarily suspended, not permanently abolished. The Amidah, the central Jewish prayer recited 3 times daily, includes an explicit petition for the rebuilding of the temple and the restoration of the sacrificial service. The Jewish Temple Institute in Jerusalem has already manufactured every ritual object required for Third Temple service, the golden menorah, the priestly garments, the altar, and has trained Levitical priests. They are waiting for the political and prophetic moment. Christianity reads the entire system as pointing forward. The book of Hebrews, written shortly before the temple's destruction, makes the argument explicit. Hebrews 10:4. It is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. The annual repetition of the sacrifices was itself the evidence of their insufficiency. If they had truly worked, they would not have needed to be repeated year after year. The system was not the solution, it was the diagram of the solution. The logic of substitution, an innocent life standing in for a guilty one. The logic of blood covering debt, the logic of the sin-bearer being sent away. All of it, Hebrews argues, was 1,000 years of preparation for one event, one sacrifice, once, that did not need to be repeated. Here is what 3,000 years of distance obscures about this system. It was not primitive. It was not superstitious. It was not the religious equivalent of throwing coins into a fountain. It was a precisely engineered legal and theological framework built around one central conviction. That violation of the moral order creates a real debt. That debt cannot be resolved by simply deciding to move on. That something must be paid. That life is the currency the system requires. And that the animal stood in the place of the person, not because the animal deserved to die, but because the framework demanded that the cost of sin be made visible, tangible, and real. Every morning, a lamb, before Jerusalem woke up, for over 1,000 years. The question the system was designed to make unavoidable was not theological, it was personal. If this much blood is required to cover what you have done, what exactly have you done?